Is there a predictable real estate cycle that can help you build wealth? We're talking about that and more tonight here on the Commercial Real Estate Report. I'm your host, Chris Berg. The mission of this show is to empower you to build generational wealth with real estate. And today we're going to dive into that with a very special guest. He is the author of this book. It's called The Secret Life of Real Estate and Banking. A couple of things I want to share with you about this book. I picked it up about a year ago. And Phil, one of the things I love about your book is that after you read it, you can't unsee what you've been shown in this book. So helps you become a better investor, helps you sort of ignore some of the media headlines. And one other anecdote about the book, it was copyrighted in 2008. Phil says in the book, hey, get ready. There's going to be a lot of opportunity for real estate investments in 2010. So somewhat prescient there. So there's just a lot of exciting things. What I want to do tonight is I want to dive into the genesis of this book, the how and why of an 18.6-year predictable real estate cycle, where we're at today, and maybe even more importantly, where are we headed and how bad are things going to get when things go in another or bad direction. So with us tonight, the author of this book, he's also the managing director of Property Share Market Economics, great economic forecasting newsletter, Phil Anderson. Phil, it is great to have you with us, and thank you for all the work you put into this book.
Yeah, hi, Chris. It's good to be here. Great.
So let's get into the genesis of the book, and then just the how and why of this predictable, based on your research, real estate cycle.
Well, yes. It's funny. We used to have a family business. It was started by my father, and this goes back into the mid 1970s, really, and then forwarding through to the 1980s, and we were in the ladies' lingerie fashion business, and it's cyclical. Clearly, fashion goes in and out. And one of the things was about our business, for some reason, ladies buy more lipstick and lingerie in a downturn. Often they seem to know when one's coming, and our business being in that side of things, lingerie and embroidery and things, we had a more profitable business sometimes, or at least in a downturn, more profitable than some other businesses because of that particular fact. So it was always intrigued me about the whole up and down of the economy and what people do in and out of recessions. And then, I went through college and university, and I did my economics degree. And we're talking late 70s, early 80s, and for people who may recall that the early 80s were a serious recession in the United States. And as it happened, my economics professors, they just couldn't answer the questions that I had. Back then, it was all about the Phillips curve, which said that you can't have high unemployment and high inflation at the same time, which, of course, late 70s, inflation at 15%, unemployment at 12%. It just didn't make sense to me. And then I decided I'd travel around the world for a year or two and see if I could find out the answers and various things. And then the downturn of first up the big boom of 1987, 88, 89, and then downturn of 1991. And I happened to come across a book. It was I've actually got it here. It was a book by Fred Harrison called The Power in the Land. And he wrote that book 1983, forecasting a big, huge boom in the UK for 1989, and then a collapse of the economy between at the peak of 1989 to the bottom of 1991. Now he did that 7 years in advance, and that was really important from my point of view, from our family's point of view, because with our lingerie business, we had a fairly profitable business in that particular quite serious downturn. One of the banks that was having a hard time we're talking in Melbourne, Australia. They came to us because they knew our family business, and all the family were working in the business, and they were trying to get all their loans off their books and trying to make their non-performing loans performing. And so we had a chance to buy 21 commercial buildings. Right, it's a fairly big thing, and we're right in the middle of a downturn, and we did not it was a very difficult decision because the commercial buildings didn't have any tenants, which meant we had to pay the upkeep of the portfolio from profits of the business, right? And then, I had Fred Harrison's book in my hand, and I just simply went to the family. We had a family meeting. And I said, Mum, Dad, kids, if this guy Fred Harrison, who I'd never met, I didn't know who he was at the time, if this guy's right, we're at the bottom of an 18.6-year real estate cycle. We went ahead, we made the purchase. You can imagine how profitable that's been, all because of knowledge of a 18.6-year real estate cycle. One thing led to another. We ended up getting some tenants for all the properties. We sold off a little bit of them to make it less loans we had outstanding on the existing buildings that we kept. And from that time, how property's gone up since then, right? And so then I sort of, one thing led to another and various things which I won't go into, but I had the chance with the information I saw in Fred to start my own business. So I decided to research US real estate because this guy, Fred Harrison, had done the UK. And you wouldn't believe it, but the first research I did, and of course this is, we're talking pre-internet, right? This is you can't recall just how difficult it was to research. And I'm sitting in a library in Melbourne, Australia, right? Little insignificant backwater, right? It's got nothing to do with the United States. Trying to research US information. So I had to borrow a book from the Library of Congress, get it sent to Australia, then return it. You can't imagine that anymore. Turns out the first thing I saw, I did the land value research, land figures in the United States, and you just wouldn't believe it, but land speculation in the United States from 1800 progressed in 18.6-year real estate, the 18.6 cycles. So land speculation peaked every 18 years. It was just unbelievable. So then I thought, well, I've got nuts and bolts here of a business that I could run on my own, independent from what the family was doing, to provide information, especially to US people, because the US economy, biggest in the world, is where all the money is, right? So I thought, well, if that's where the money is, let's go that way. And it's just been unbelievable since. And as the cycle developed from 1991, as we went into the top in 2007, I was ready for that top. I knew it was coming. So it's been a progression from there. And then the problem is when leading from that, so I sort of had a business I could talk some information. But what staggered me was I was finding that nobody was tending to believe it when I thought about things, because the problem is, if I can take just 1 minute more to finish off your first question, if you take a pen here, right, and if I was to drop this pen, as you know, the law of gravity says it's going to fall this way. And no scientist worth anything would say, well, no, that's not actually right. It's actually, you drop it, it'll go upwards, yes. When I come on, when I talk in front of the public, and, I'm talking to you now and all the people listening, and I start talking about a real estate cycle, I just sound like another forecaster, another prognosticator, talking about the cycle. And, I've got my forecast for you, and forecasts are a dime a dozen and various things like that, right? And that's so I would urge listeners to try and weigh that up, because there is a fundamental law in economics that is exactly the same for economics as gravity is for science. And it's David Ricardo back in 1810. It's his law of economic rent. And basically he's saying that the rent takes all the gains, and so land value will always keep going up, mostly subject to declines here and there because of all the society's developments and inventions and everything else, that in the finish it doesn't lift wages, it lifts land price. And so when I went out and spoke to people about this, I was getting a negative reaction from economists who would sit there like this in their seats and say, what does this guy know? So I wrote a book. So then I thought, right, I'd have to do a book, and I put the book together. It took me quite a number of years to end up getting it together. It took me another few years to find a publisher, and then now you have it. So it was good. I'm very glad I wrote it. It does lift credibility and profile, and I've had some fantastic feedback on it, as you've noticed yourself. Once you get it, once you see the cycle, but not only just see the cycle, but actually understand that we do actually in the first place have to get a cycle, and then it is going to inevitably repeat. Once you see that, you can't unsee it. And feedback I've had from the book like that, people who write in and my members and subscribers, they tell me the stories about when it first clicked for them, when they first realised, and then some people come up and tell me how they've been able to then make their investments. And the biggest feedback I get is it just calms people's level of stress in the economy and understanding the economy, because you really can start to forecast the movement, even more particularly, especially in the United States, because that's where it all happens, and that's where the cycle begins and ends. And so it's been a wild ride.
So I want to touch on the how and why of the 18.6 years in a moment,
Yes.
but you're alluding to something that I really appreciate, because even over the last few days, and if you want to speak to this, please do so, but everyone's hair is on fire, and because of reading your book, being a newsletter member, I've been pretty calm, like, it's kind of a little blip, probably a little correction. And I say that because one of the things you repeat in the book is, hey, look, if you ever listen to a forecaster that doesn't tie it to land, don't listen to anything, like ignore them, because they don't get it. So speak to, and you've touched on it a bit, but why is the land piece so important? You've also said in the book that, hey, land is a great predictor of an upcoming recession. You said land typically tops out 12 to 24 months before an incoming recession. So how do you determine if land's at its top price or not?
Yes, well, that's the thing. The stock market is big, but the actual rent of land, the actual real estate market's way bigger, and that has the major effect on various things. And with the stock market is where everything is priced in quickly and first, but it will get ahead of itself sometimes, and then, as it's done over the last couple of months, when something comes up to slightly rethink the reason why it got ahead of itself, the stock market has to make a fairly quick adjustment, which it's doing the last couple of days. And everybody gets nervous and worried, because it can sometimes be a fairly large correction in a number of days. But that's what the stock market does, and it's only pricing in the next couple of months, and it's not the bigger picture. And one of the things that can help you, which is what I do for my subscribers, I try to teach them how to read a chart. And so if I can refer to back what happened in 2023, back in March, despite the fact that we had a Silicon Valley Bank, looked like it might go out of business, and there were fears that it might be contagious and it might bring back memories of what happened in 2007. Some of the other rest of the market, particularly housing stocks, and if you're able to look at charts for people listening to this and watching, back in March 2023, and then for the next month or two, April, May, housing stocks started breaking up into all-time new highs, which was the market telling you that despite what was going on with Silicon Valley Bank, earnings at housing stocks were actually going to increase over the next couple of months. So if you could actually see that within the construct of a real estate cycle, that development in the stock market was telling you that we were about to enter the final stages of the real estate cycle. So sort of what I try to do is get people to understand the real estate cycle first, and then have a go at looking at what happens in the stock markets, because you can use the stocks in the stock market to help you determine where you are in the real estate cycle, as long as you've understood the real estate cycle first and how the real estate cycle moves. And so one of the things that was fantastic about the United States when I started doing my research is that the US has information on just about anything and everything. And also there's been quite a number of people that have done research and various things on all sorts of varied and wonderful and exotic, interesting areas of information, right? So there were two guys back in the 1930s, Homer Hoyt out of Chicago and Roy Wenslick in St. Louis. And Homer Hoyt wrote a university thesis, the thesis was published in 1933 as a book, 100 Years of Land Values in Chicago. I urge people to read. All real estate investors should have that in their library, because it explains how Chicago, nowhere else but just Chicago, went through cycles from about 1820 something when it was founded till about 1933. And the reason why Homer Hoyt was able to research so much about Chicago real estate, because there was a guy, this is unbelievable really, there was a guy called George Olcott that decided in his lifetime he would keep a record of every single real estate transaction that took place in Chicago. And he published them in what's called the Blue Books. I mean, can you imagine that? Just spending your entire life recording real estate deeds and what the sale price and what happened. But fortunately he did, because it enabled Homer Hoyt to produce a great thesis on real estate and the cyclical stuff of it. And then there was Roy Wenslick in St. Louis, that he was probably the world's first economic forecaster. He showed the real estate cycle in St. Louis, and you put them two together, especially what Homer Hoyt did. That enabled me then to construct sort of like a clock for real estate that shows you from the bottom what happens on a basis of sort of like a yearly basis from one year to the next within that 18.6 year cycle. And once you can see that, it's unbelievable how it moves. And I know you yourself have seen it. You get to see. So when we're in the second half of a real estate cycle, you get tall buildings start to open up, you get lavish government expenditure, and then you get a frenetic real estate market. And that's exactly what's been happening. I mean, it's just absolutely astounding, really.
So let's jump into that. If you can share, so this, I want to let our audience know, this is from a webinar that you did for people that are members of the Property Share Market Economics newsletter. This is your partner, Akil Patel, up in the corner, but he does a nice job of just graphically laying out, where we're at, which is the green dot, where he believes we're at today. But before we get to that, if you can just talk about why 18.6 years, like what's happening within the banking system, or however you want to explain the thesis, but why 18.6 years?
Well, it's all based on earnings. Now, if I can talk about a stock for a minute, nobody tends to have any trouble with, say, I don't know, you pick a famous stock like I don't know, a bank, one of the big banks. They earn profits, and the stock market will break that down as earnings per share. And people generally tend to understand that the price of that share is going to be a multiple of the earnings. And so generally big banks are priced at about 12 times earnings per share. So in other words, if you buy a share of Goldman Sachs or something, and let's say it's $100 or whatever it is, and it pays a dividend to you every year, and if it's based on 20 times earnings, then it's going to be 20 years to get your money back. Well, you can actually apply the same thing to real estate or to land, and land is the price of an appraised plot is usually about 20 times its earnings, and so it's the capitalization of those earnings into a price that generally will give rise to a real estate cycle, because we are allowing private individuals to take that rent, so they buy and sell. You then get the situation where banks then enter the situation with their credit, that they create their credit based on the land value, and so that then will, as I've showed in my book, that it's how much credit gets created against the land price that will determine the volatility of the upside and the downside. And then once you get to see it, the only question you've got to ask yourself after that is why the cycle is so regular. It's never really been shorter than 17 years and never longer than 21, as Homer Hoyt stated for Chicago. But it really has since 1955. It's almost been pinpoint perfect at 18 and a half years. And so why we get 18 and a half, well, that's another thing. I think it's got something to do with the capitalization rate. In other words, the interest rate. The long run interest rate's generally about 5%. And so at an interest rate of 5%, if you invest at 5%, it takes 14 years to get your money back. And so that has generally, I think, led to 14 years of rising prices within the actual real estate cycle itself. And if you go back, certainly, and in my book, I've done this since 1800. And once Akil, my co-director, business partner, he put that in probably what looks like a better graph, which is the one you've got in front of you. It really has, since when the land price bottoms in the United States, and I know every state's different, but as a homogenous type of taking all of the land in the US all at once, generally the cycle has taken about 7 years from the bottom. And so when real estate bottomed in 2012 in the United States, all we were able to do was quite simple based on past cycles. You add 7 years to the bottom, that'll take you up to the top of the first half of the cycle. So this graph we have in front of you, Akil did that. He did that in 2014. It's not something that we've just created today, which suggested that we would get a real estate. The first half of the real estate cycle would peak around about the end of 2019. We would then get a slowdown. Something would cause that slowdown to happen. That would be into 2021, after which we get another 6.5, 7 years up, take us into 2025, 2026. I think it'll be 2026. And, Akil, and he's described there what happens during the cycle. And at the moment, currently, where the green dot is, that's where we think we are at the moment, which I think is probably, once you see the cycle, it's reasonably self-explanatory. We're halfway through the next second half, the second expansion. And it's in the second half that you get looser monetary policy. We start to get a construction boom. Countries around the world vie for the tallest building. And you can see that's going on in earnest right now. It's been quite unbelievable. I noticed, of all things, the Oklahoma have come out and announced that they're going to build the world's tallest building. I've got no idea why it would be Oklahoma. I've got no idea what's happening there, but it must be something, because they reckon they're going to build the world's tallest. And so the competition starts, and then you end up usually at the same time. Every single cycle, it's been the same every single cycle since about 1900. Lavish government expenditure comes out for the government because they've got to keep things ticking over, and they don't want revolutions and various things. And so we see a lot of expenditure on, and in this case, in the United States, in this particular cycle, it's turned up. It's quite lavish government subsidies from the Biden administration, and that'll, regardless of what happens with the election coming up, should it be won by the Democratic side, they'll continue those policies. If it ends up with the Republican side, you can see what's already coming: tax cuts and various things, which will just push the cycle even higher. So it's all coming out, really.
Let me ask you this: if you can act as my coach for a moment, we develop self-storage. I'm in acquisition, so I'm the person that's out buying the land. So as we're putting together our portfolio based on your real estate cycle, when would you say is, like, let's say we've got 4 to 8 beautiful self-storage sites, when would be the ideal time to sell those to maximize the premium?
Well, that's not always an easy question, because I don't know the circumstances of every individual investor, and I'm not necessarily always trying to suggest that with existing portfolio and existing holdings you try and time the cycle exactly. The purpose of where we are at now, and the guide to the cycle that you've got in front of you, from about this year going forward, and then certainly as we go into the what I think will be the peak 2026, because history shows that a fairly significant land price-led recession happens at the end of every 14 years up. Now is not the time to be attempting to establish a really big portfolio if you have to do it 100% geared, and then borrow even more money from another bank to make sure you get the process and make sure to do everything else. It's not the time to begin something now going in massively geared. Now, whether it's the time for an existing portfolio to sell it all, well, I've always thought myself, and with our portfolio we've got with our family, we're not sellers. we've been buyers over the cycle, but we're happy with what we've got. All we've tried to do going into every peak, and we saw 2007, 8, 9 coming, is just pay down our gearing a little bit, so that when the eventual downturn does happen, you look good for the bank, because during those times of the downturn, the bank is trying to offload non-performing assets. So if you look good to the bank, you stand a better chance of picking up some of those assets at very good discounts. And so I'm not suggesting that we should try and buy at the bottom and sell everything at the top. But as we go over the next couple of years, it is, in my opinion, the time to be putting your house in order and putting your portfolio in order, and you try to present yourself in a very effective, well-run position, so the banks can see that you're running a very effective portfolio, and so you just make yourself look as good as you can for the bank, and that's the general idea. So it's just trying to use the cycle to your advantage. I hope that makes sense for people. I never created the cycle and wrote my book to try and show that you can buy everything at the bottom and then sell it all at the top. You may try and work that out, but then you've got tax considerations and everything else that happens, right? So all that comes into play. And I'm not an investment advisor, so I don't know everybody's personal position, but I think you get the idea as this sort of the ebb and flow. Yeah. And so, as you go into the peak of the cycle, and I'm sure you're seeing at the moment with land prices so high, it's harder to try and make things work. The yields compress and various things, and you end up, if you want to get the land you want, sometimes you've got to overpay for it. Well, now's not really the time to do that. You try and save up for a good cash position, a relatively good cash position, because I think the next downturn, which happens after 14 years up of land prices, and that happens in 2026, that's when we reach the 14th year up. After that, land prices will be too high. We should get the usual downturn. It's happened 11 times since 1792 in the United States, so there's fairly good odds that it's coming again.
I think what might be hard for some people to digest, and based on
I understand that.
This is based on what I'm reading in this graphic, is that if the green dot is where we're at, and you think about how rates have gone up, housing prices in the United States have gone up dramatically since COVID. But what I'm hearing you say is, hey, Chris, we're just beginning. Like, there's still another couple of years for these housing prices to escalate pretty rapidly. Is that a fair assessment on my part?
Yes. It's, if you go back and what happened, let's just say people might have a memory of the prior cycle, say from 2003. I mean, you think about what was happening in 2001. We all remember the tragic events of 9/11, and then into 2002 and 2003, the things that were happening in Iraq and in the Middle East. I remember in 2003 having conversations with people. We really thought the world was going to end in 2003. Everything that was happening around the Middle East and various things, and then Afghanistan, it was scary. What's going on at the moment, I don't think has anything on how 2003 looked. And then nobody thought that there'd be the massive boom that we got into 2005, 6 and 7. I remember I used to go to the United States yearly from about 1996 onwards, because I was writing my book. So I'd pick a state that I'd go into the US, usually summertime. I'd pick a state that I'd go and travel through and try and sit down and write my book a bit for a month or so. And that was when I was studying, back in 2004 or something like that. I was in St. Louis at the Thomas Jefferson Library there, and they've got a whole room there on all Roy Wenslick's material. I was at the airport, and I was at one of the stations down there, and 2005 and 6, all you could see was what Paris Hilton was doing. I mean, she was the flavour of the month, if you can remember back that far. And then in 2007, the iPhone hit the markets, and people went nuts. I mean, it really, really did. So I'm seeing all that echo with all of the artificial intelligence and everything that's happening at the moment. There's a lot of money to be spent. So it wouldn't be the first time if things really progressed from here and everything got excited. It was the same back in 1984. 1983, 84, 85, there were also Middle East troubles. We were the United States was dealing with that troublesome dictator Saddam Hussein and what was going on in Iran. Things haven't changed that much, really. And people were nervous back then. And then 1987, October 87, we got that almighty stock market crash, which, I was trading back then, I remember it. I remember as if it happened yesterday. The Dow came down by 50% in the space of, a week, 2 weeks. I mean, it was a really big thing, but real estate house prices, they kept going up right into 1980s, 88, 89, right around the world. It was just a really big speculative frenzy that was taking place, and the Dow recovered fairly quickly. And here we are now. We're worried about the same things, and housing prices keep going up. So it's an interesting question you ask because you have to ask yourself why. And I think, if I may say so humbly, I think which you can say which I think you saw as a member of all the material I write, as a subscriber. I think I was the only person in the world back in 2022 and 2023 that said as interest rates went up, and they went up fairly rapidly, I said to everybody I knew that as interest rates went up, house prices would continue going up. Yes. Now I wasn't saying that there'd be that it'd be fun for everybody. That clearly there's been some trouble in various markets, and people who were, it did create a few problems for people, which was unexpected and wasn't foreseen. But as a general rule, if you look back since 1955, the Fed has lifted rates 11 times, and 11 of those times, exactly the same every time, house prices continued to go up or stayed about the same level, but never on any occasion fell. And it's just intrigued me why nobody can ever see their history like that. And if I can say, economists, the Fed has 1,000 economists working for them, I believe. And this is because the role of the land market, it's been completely written out of the economic textbooks. Economics like that, it has been corrupted. Before the First World War, every economist understood that there were three factors of production: land, labour and capital, land in particular. And people saw it back then because most of the world were farmers, and they progressed from that. But then after the First World War, and generally what was happening from there, because there were so many, sort of like in the late 1800s, there were so many land reform movements that were happening. It was starting to threaten the established interests, especially in the United Kingdom. So there was a job done on economics to write land out of the equation, and now all economists are taught that land is part of capital. So it's just land and it's just labour and capital, and so you miss the whole thing about the role of land. And then once land is taken out, you'll never get taught it at an economics university. So you'll never have a chance to study it. You'll never start to interpret how an economy can be cyclical, and it's a great shame because it's been missed, and so it leads then for people originally like myself and like others, you tend to make it's much easier to make poor investment decisions based on incomplete knowledge because the role of land's been written out of economics. And so then when you get a downturn like we do at a correction in the stock market, you then have, you start to get worried about, what am I going to do? What do I do with my investments? What's the economy going to do now? And then you get economists come out and say, well, it looks like we'll get yet another recession. They're forecasting so many recessions all the time. What's a person to do? So it's been so helpful for me, and I hear it from all my subscribers. They write in all the time and say, Phil, it's just taken all the stress away from investing. It doesn't mean it's stress less, obviously, but it just takes all the worry, the day-to-day worry, out of your investment making decisions.
Yeah, Phil, I think one of the things that I'm just so grateful about the information you put out, like I come from the media, right? So I was used to these day-to-day headlines and all the just fear and anger that gets sewed into the consciousness. And when you understand the real estate cycle and the information you put out, it allows you just to sort of throw those headlines to the, because you're like, this doesn't mean anything. It doesn't really matter. So I want to touch on this. You mentioned, hey, Chris, there's been a repeat of the cycle since 1792. There's a couple times, though, it's been disrupted, and that's by war. And you've mentioned the Middle East. I mean, today, Egyptian Airlines said, hey, don't fly over Iran tonight. I mean, do you see a potential of this cycle being disrupted?
Well, it's always possible. I don't have a day-to-day crystal ball as such. I mean, I've got my great working model of over an 18.6 year period. But it's always possible. Things can happen. Just hotheads and various things, and the situation in the Middle East, it does look grim.
Yes.
But all I can say is if people get a chance to have a look at in my book I document the 11 prior cycles in some detail, and you get to see that really at this current time it's never really been any different.
Yeah.
Now in the second half of the real estate cycle, there's a lot more money around, a lot more rent has been manifest. People chase that rent. Dictators come forward to capture that rent in various economies, especially if their economy has a prodigious amount of resources, like you see in, say, Argentina and other places like that. The Middle East empires they're doing the same. Since oil was discovered, there's just one family after another that tries to get hold of it. So the current dreadful events in the Middle East, it isn't really any different from what it's been like in other times at this part of the cycle. What did interrupt the cycle was the First World War. That happened. That started right at the peak of that cycle. That happened from about 1896 into 1914, and then the Second World War, which I would really consider was a basic continuation of the first. The First World War meant that we didn't really see the downturn from the prior upturn because the government took over. And then after we had the Great Depression, after the really big, huge, roaring 1920s, after that downturn, that dreadful downturn in the Depression, that led directly to the Second World War. And there was no cycle to speak of through that war because the US government forbid speculation, and you couldn't buy and sell anything else except bonds and various things, and the government was vying for your savings because they had a water fight. So it's not quite the same at the moment, but it is possible like that. But even then, if hostilities did really break out in the Middle East, I don't really think it's not really going to create a downturn because war is generally profitable for business. Commodities get bought and sold still. The only thing that might happen would be there'd be probably less speculation permitted if the US government went all in, because they'd be asking people to buy war bonds and various things like that. So that tends to soak up some of the excess speculative capital. But I would be very surprised. In fact, it'd be the first time ever in history it would lead to a major downturn.
I want to get into the downturn here. So you're suggesting, hey, Chris, let's look into 2026. You think there's still going to be this, what you call the winner's curse, and then post 2026, things will start to go towards a downturn. Now, my question for you is, what do you think is going to be the catalyst to that? And I share that in the context of, there's over $2.9 trillion of commercial real estate loans that are coming due between 2024 and 2028. Do you feel like that's going to be the catalyst, or what do you think?
Not at the moment. If we're at the same time in the cycle, let's go back in 2003, 1983, 84. We're talking 1967, 68, same time in the cycle like that, right? There were also difficulties back then. At the moment, there is obviously there are difficulties in some commercial areas. I think for the moment, around the world and in the US, government will get a bit of a handle on that first because they'll be able to look in some particular areas, and I think they're possibly already doing this in Boston already. Some of the existing real estate buildings that are empty, the government and the council, the local government there, they get the chance to perhaps at the moment convert or enforce conversion of those commercial warehouses and various things into housing, so that can take place. Also, at the moment, there is still an enormous amount of cash around. I think is it Warren Buffett? What's the figure they quoted the other day? 250
billion in cash.
Yeah, this is a lot of money. I could do a lot with that money, Chris. I tell you. Apple's got a lot of money on there. Microsoft, they've got a lot of cash available, and there are still a lot of vulture funds around. They will come in and they'll assess what those things are worth now, and they'll work out whether they can convert it or buy in and put it to other uses or whatever else that has to be done. So all that's got to go through yet. I don't really see that too much as a problem. I think the next move on interest rates will be down. This will bring a lot more people into the market. The reason why it was suggested that the current time from about now into 2026, which is what it was the prior cycle, say 2005 into 2007, and say from 1987 into 1989, just to go back a couple of cycles. The reason why we've called it the winner's curse phase is more to do with residential than anything else. And so it is likely sometimes that it has been usual sometimes that the interest rates drop a little after they were lifted, and we're at that time where that may happen. That will bring a lot more people into the market because housing itself, but aka land prices, but housing will become that much more unaffordable because mortgages did go up. The government then tries to create all sorts of structures to make housing more affordable. So you see a lengthening in the mortgage process. So we go from 10 or 20 or 30-year mortgages. In Australia, they're talking here now of 50-year mortgages. They'll do the same thing in the UK. I think America will probably do something similar. It may not happen from the major banks, but it'll probably happen from some of the fringe lenders. And so that's one way to make housing more affordable. That brings a lot more first home buyers into the market at what I would consider exactly the wrong time, where we're going into the peak. And so when the peak does happen, which at some point we must get some sort of downturn, those sort of people go into negative equity because they'll have bought at the peak, and then that's why we call it the winner's curse. So it's more from the residential point of view. So you've got to be really careful now from a cyclical point of view about the mortgage you take out and various things. You just don't want to be doing something you can't afford.
So I want to talk about what you see coming. So let's say we get through this cycle and all of a sudden the downturn happens. I want to share with you a clip from an interview that you did this is from 2023. I want to share with our audience what you said and then just give you a chance to add some context to it. Okay. So this is you saying, hey guys, get ready. Once this peak hits, be prepared. And here's what you shared back in 2020.
I don't usually rewatch my things. This would be novel.
Enjoy, because it was good.
We have to find ways to avoid revolution, and that's when you start to see things really happen. And it'll just be the repeat formula, right? I'm telling your viewers, get ready for what's coming after 2026, because every time there's a land price-led downturn, the fundamentals change, right? And the banks will start using the AI. They'll be able to very well know what your personal circumstances are. They'll be able to determine whether you should continue with the loan or not. Landlords and banks themselves, they'll be able to use the AI on the phone to say that if you can't end up paying your mortgage or you can't pay the rent, they'll be able to lock the house from your phone. They'll be able to lock you out of your own premises probably. There'll be all sorts of technology come through that is going to make people's life really hard if you're too much in debt. I tell you, people can't see it, but things turn. When they do turn, they turn vicious, and that's when the technology that's been newly invented, that's when it turns to its dark side, and it's used to throw people out of work, throw people out of their homes, and all sorts of other stuff. And that's when.
So, Phil, it's a lot said there. What do you see happening in this downturn, and how should people prepare?
Yes, well, I think I said that before the AI stuff started, really, I think, didn't I, from memory? See, on the upside, everything looks rosy and everything looks fantastic and it's blue sky ahead. But when the downturn starts taking place, and as we get further into the downturn, corporations and individuals and property owners, and even the property users, they start to find that they've got space that they didn't think they had. So they contract a little bit and they start doing more with less. This time, I think, even more than any other time, during COVID, people were able to work from home. And I personally thought this was absolutely fantastic. And I think, a lot of people got used to it. And it was very difficult to entice people to come back to the office in the first instance. And people found that's when we started using the technology in earnest, and Zoom and everything else. And we were able to start doing things from home that we didn't think we'd ever do outside the office. But when the next downturn happens, if your job can be done from home, it means it can also be done from anywhere else in the world. And so there'll be outsourcing in earnest. And rather than paying like an American or an Australian wage, which can be, 10, 20, 30 bucks an hour, leading to, the average, whatever the average wage is, some of your jobs might be able to be done from, say, the Philippines or from India or other things, yes, and that can be done at $2.50, $3 an hour or whatever it is. So that's the first thing. So if your job can be done at home, it can also be outsourced to any part of the world. That will start to happen in earnest as corporations seek to reduce costs. Not only that, but I suspect with AI this time, there'll be certain industries that just are completely replaced by what AI can do. That happens in earnest when corporations really have to reduce costs. They're not so much under pressure at the moment because with the lifting in costs and inflation and things, it's quite easy for them to pass it on now. But in the downturn, it becomes that much harder to pass on costs. So they've got to do cost savings otherwise, and it's labour that bears the brunt of that. In addition, as well, you get the situation where if people start to see that prices are going to be lower tomorrow than they are today, then they stop buying and they wait. And that's what happens initially with the housing market. They start to, when the turn happens, people think, well, I'm not going to buy my house today because it's probably going to be cheaper tomorrow. And so you get that period of a year and a half, whatever it is, where there's buying dries up because people understand that prices could be lower. So the look of a downturn is fundamentally different to the upturn. So, I think and the way that technology will be used I think it's going to be difficult for people that can't pay their debts or owe a lot on houses and cars, because there'll be new ways to get the assets back.
So just to summarize for people so they can get a feel for the cycle, you're suggesting, hey, Chris, we still got a couple of years of this winner's curse where prices are going to go up precipitously, then look at mid 2026 and beyond for the downturn to start, and then just get ready and be prepared to deploy some capital and get some good deals. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, if the real estate cycle is to repeat, that's how it's going to repeat. And as you've seen, I've called the repeat starting in 2012. I said we'd go the way the clock has done, and it did do it. And the current events where we are at the moment, I put 2023, 2024, where we'd be getting lavish government expenditure and the competition for the world's tallest. I put that on my clock 2014. I said in 2014 that's what would be happening in 2023, 2024, and it is. So far, the turn, the clock, the real estate cycle since the bottom in 2012, it's been pretty good. So, and I don't see any reason now at the moment why that won't continue. So, I just assume it will continue, and I just make my investment judgments based on that. And I've spent the last 6 months organising my own affairs. I've sold one place in Melbourne that I should never really have bought. Really, it was never really performing, and it was the wrong thing. We've all done that before, but I turned that into cash, and I've paid down one other place, and the new place I bought, the new apartment, I bought that in the name of my son. So that's attempted to set him up so that when the downturn, if it takes place or when it takes place, he's only 22 at the moment, but he'll have an asset behind him that will give him a kickstart for the next cycle. I'm not going to do it for him. That's his decisions to make, but I've given him the start as my father did for me. And so I've organised that. I'm happy with that. Since he was born, I put 50 US every week into a cash account. Myself, me, you know, when I started writing my book, I moved to France, and that's where my son grew up. But we're fortunate, same in Australia, same in France. I never had to start a college fund for tuition like you have to do in the US. So I was able to just, when he turned 21, I put that cash over to him. I don't think he'd ever seen such big figures in his entire life, but you know, that's what my father did for me. So that's just trying to set him up at the peak at the moment. You know, he knows he's at the stage of life where he's probably trying to find a nice girlfriend and think about a wife and various things. And you know, I've just tried to say to him, you know, the decisions that you make with a house, it's usually one of the biggest decisions you make in your life. And if you make it at precisely the wrong time in the cycle, it can ruin you for the rest of your life. It really can, as people saw in 2008 and 2009. So it's something that you've got to try and at least get reasonably correct. And so that's what I've tried to do for myself and with my subscribers and various things like that. At least get them to think a little bit more about not rushing into investments based on emotion and based on big smiles and what they like and what they don't like. It's got to be a hard-headed business decision, and if you can use the cycle time to guide you with the timing, well, that's just absolutely fantastic. So that's what I've tried to do on a personal capacity, and you can see that with my subscribers. They've been helpful to be able to make the same sort of decisions.
So that's a great question. What are you currently doing right now? Are you going more defensive into cash or bonds or more defensive portfolio?
Well, defensive, yes. The commercial stuff that the family has, we've just tried to reduce the loan to value, which we're down to about 50% now, which we're happy with. But I'm also, it's not just what I'm necessarily doing at this time of the cycle. I'm also at a stage, you know, I'm in my 60s now, so I am trying to wind down a bit. I don't want to be, I want to write another book or two, so I don't really want to be making the investment decisions that I made before. So I have been winding that part down, but that's on a personal level. I'd be doing it a little different if I was in my 30s and 40s. I'd be gearing up to put myself in a situation where I present myself well to the banks in 4 or 5 years' time, and I'd be comfortable trying to do that. I'd also, if I was back in my 30s and 40s, I would take the time, as I did when I was back that age, to actually learn about these things and spend my time researching and, you know, do a bit of courses where you can and learn about how the stock market works, learn about how the real estate cycle works, learn about the deficiencies in economics and the deficiencies in finance, and that you should never really allow these decisions to be made by someone else. You've got to take it on board yourself and various things. You know, of course, some of the mistakes I made over the years, you know, but when you're young, you can afford to make those mistakes because you get the chance to start again, whatever it has, and you know, and various things. I tell my son he should always keep a reserve of cash, 10 or 20K as an absolute minimum, because if he ever does make a real serious mistake, you can actually take that cash out and start again. So you never put everything on the line. And so I'm at that stage myself in just this part of this particular cycle, this real estate cycle. I've seen 3. You know, it's just time for me to wind down a little bit. I don't wish to retire the richest man in the cemetery. So I do want to spend it a little. And I've been very lucky over the time. I look back very fondly on my trips through the United States, we're in places where I wrote the book. You know, it's a funny thing. My favourite place in the United States, which I never thought would actually happen, is Texas. I traveling from El Paso down to the Big Bend and areas like that with the buttes and the scenery. You get a real. Australians are used to this. Australia, you travel to Australia, you get a real sense of freedom. But traveling to Texas as well, you get an enormous, amazing sense of freedom. So, I look back fondly on my time there doing all the travel.
Last question for you, and then I'll give you the last word is, so, and I kind of mentioned this before, but based on the cycle and with all these events coming to Los Angeles and all the infrastructure investment money coming in, would you see LA as a good place to make some investments for real estate?
Yes, it's the Olympic Games and those things that happen. They do affect the cycle on a city-specific location. Just in Australia ourselves, up in Northern Australia in Brisbane, we have the Olympic Games in 2032. So that is going to where those big investments take place at particular times in the cycle. That does affect the cycle in that state or in that city. So let me give you some examples so you might be able to relate this to LA. The Olympic Games were held in London in 2012, and I was there at that time. And the English, what the English can be like. They're always a bit joking about themselves, and they always worried about their ability to do things. They're completely different to the Americans. They were all scared that the 2012 Olympics would be a big, huge, massive flop. And then when it was shown that the Bond took the Queen out of the airplane and various other things that were happening, it was hugely exciting. That kicked off the real estate cycle in the United Kingdom from the bottom. And it was very bullish. Up until the Olympics of 2012 in London, things were really bearish. There'd been riots and there'd been everything else. And actually, nobody knew when the next kickoff would happen, and then the Olympics took place and it kicked things off. The Olympics were in Sydney in 2000, and that was mid-cycle, and so Sydney from about 2001 in 2007, the second half of the real estate cycle never really did anything because all the building and the construction was sort of brought forward for the Olympics. And so when you get something that's happening at the end of the Olympics or beyond into 2028, 2020, 2030, that will give Los Angeles the ability to stagger their infrastructure and probably alleviate the downturn that might take place. So you've just got to put that within the context of the larger real estate cycle. I don't study cities individually per se. My book's just all about the structure of the real estate cycle within the United States itself. And you can see over history, the United States has had that real estate cycle. But not every city has partaken in the real estate cycle. You have to also think that Denver, for example, with its sprawl, and LA with its sprawl, and other United States cities that have that sprawl, and El Paso is another one where the city can expand and go right out and can go really over the top towards the second half, and they do a lot of expansion of the city into the sprawl, into the countryside. That can take a while to recover. But cities like San Francisco and New York that are hemmed in as they are by the bay and by the sea, they tend to recover much quicker because the city can't expand as it does. So you have to be able to take the theoretical basis of the 18.6 year real estate cycle, and then you've got to overlay it and apply your own local real estate knowledge as to where you are to then think about what might happen. And that's important to do. I can't answer that particularly for every specific question, but and perhaps one final example, usually the biggest downturn takes place where the world's tallest is being built. That's now in Oklahoma. So I'd be interested to see what happens in Oklahoma. Probably they would have a fairly significant downturn, worse than the rest of the United States, but that's just based on historical things. So we've got to see how that plays out.
Well, Phil, I want to say thank you for your time. I want to be respectful of it. We talked about doing an hour, so thank you so much. I want to invite everybody, just do yourself a favor and get the book. It's a phenomenal read. And Phil, I just want to give you the last word. Anything else you want to add or share that I haven't asked you?
No, it was all pretty good. I hope to get to the United States soon and visit again. It's been fantastic having researched the history of it. It's a marvelous history. You know what Americans have done with the country, the can-do spirit. It's fantastic for me to see. You know, Australians are very similar, like in the same sort of way. So it's been great to be here, and thanks to be on.
It's been great. I mean, hopefully we can have you back because we didn't really talk about the power of speculation and really how The Virginia company back in the early 1600s is what created the United States. And so it's just, there's so many things to discuss with you. I just am grateful for the work you put in, and we'll do this again. Okay.
Great.
Thank you. Again, Phil Anderson. Check out the book. It's fantastic. Here's his website, propertysharemarketeconomics.com, as well, if you want to find out more about what they're doing to educate people out there. Again, this is the Commercial Real Estate Report, empowering you to build generational wealth with real estate.